Step off the property. Now.
I'm not leaving.
You don't live here.
Officer, you're ordering a judge off her own home.
Dispatch, I need a supervisor. Possible trespass.
A squad car idled at the curb like it owned the street. The red and blue lights weren't on. That was the part that made it feel personal. "Step off the property," the officer said, voice clipped, hand already resting on his belt. "Now." The woman in the doorway didn't move. She stood barefoot on her own front steps, one hand holding a set of house keys, the other holding a small folder that looked like it belonged in a courthouse, because it did. "I'm not leaving," she said calmly. "Ma'am," he snapped, louder this time. "I said step off the property. You don't live here." She blinked once, slow and deliberate, then spoke with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't beg to be believed. "Officer, you are currently ordering a judge off her own home," she said. There was a beat. The officer's jaw tightened as if the word judge had offended him. Then he did what would later cost a city years of litigation, a department a public scandal, and, according to the complaint, $5.1 million. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor," he said. "Possible trespass. Subject is refusing lawful commands." And the moment those words left his mouth, everything that followed became a chain. A chain the body camera wouldn't let anyone break, because the camera didn't care who was right. It just kept recording. And by the time the public saw the footage, the question wasn't whether the woman lived there. The question was how an officer could stand on a quiet residential street and decide, without evidence, without verification, without hesitation, that a black woman couldn't possibly own the house behind her, and why, when she told him who she was, he still didn't stop. It started on a Tuesday morning that looked too ordinary to become a headline. Sunlight spilled through bare winter branches. The air had that crisp edge that made every breath feel clean. A few houses down, a lawn crew was already at work, the low buzz of a leaf blower carrying across the block like background noise. This was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from porches, where joggers ran with earbuds in and dogs tugged on leashes, where the biggest drama, most weeks, was an overloaded recycling bin. And on that morning, Judge Amina Hayes was supposed to be invisible. That's what she wanted anyway. Amina had just moved into the house 2 months earlier, a century-old colonial with a deep front porch and tall windows that caught the morning light like glass mirrors. It wasn't a mansion, but it had weight, history, the kind of home that made you feel like you were stepping into someone else's story. Amina had grown up in a small apartment above a beauty supply store, where the sound of city buses and the smell of hot asphalt were part of the air. Her mother ran the store's register like a drill sergeant, and her father worked double shifts driving freight. They taught her 2 things early. 1, education is leverage. 2, dignity is non-negotiable. Amina took those lessons and built a life from them. Top of her class, law school, on scholarship, years as a public defender before she became a prosecutor, then a judge. Now, in her early 40s, she was the kind of judge attorneys learned to respect fast. Not because she was harsh, because she was precise. She didn't raise her voice in court. She didn't need to. Her questions were sharp enough to cut through anyone's performance. And on that Tuesday morning, she wasn't wearing her robe or sitting on the bench. She was in a long sweater, hair wrapped up, coffee cooling in a mug she hadn't finished. She had docket notes spread across her kitchen island and a case file tucked under her arm. If you had driven past, you would have seen a normal homeowner on a normal day. But the neighborhood didn't see her that way. Not all of them. Some had watched the house sit empty for years. An elderly couple had lived there, then passed. The property changed hands twice. Contractors came and went. The porch railings got repaired, the paint got redone, the grass got cut, and then, one morning, a black woman was on the steps. To some people, that was just reality. To one person on that block, it was a question they decided to ask with a phone call. The call went into the non-emergency line around 8:12 a.m. A neighbor's voice, tense, deliberate, described someone suspicious at the old Hayes property. They said they'd never seen the woman before. They said they thought the house might be vacant. They said the woman was trying to get inside. And then they added a detail that changed the way dispatch coded the call. They said there might be a break-in. In a quiet neighborhood, those two words carry weight. Dispatch sent an officer, Officer Brian Keller, early 30s, 6 years on the force. A record that looked clean, on paper. No major discipline, no headline scandals. The kind of cop supervisors liked because he was reliable. He arrived on the block at 8:21. He didn't roll up with lights and sirens. He came slow, like someone expecting to catch a person in the act. And the first thing the body camera caught wasn't a break-in, it was Amina's front door opening, and Amina stepping onto the porch. The interaction began the way these things often do, small, almost casual, until the tone shifts. "Ma'am," Keller said as he walked up the sidewalk, "can I talk to you for a second?" Amina's instincts kicked in before her legal training did. She didn't step down. She stayed on the porch, a subtle choice, a boundary. "Yes?" she asked. "We got a call about someone trying to get into this residence," Keller said. Amina lifted her keys slightly. "That would be me. I live here." Keller's eyes flicked past her shoulder, into the house. Then he looked back at her and, without checking any record, without asking for context, said the sentence that would later be played on news broadcasts and frozen in court filings. "No, you don't." Amina paused, not because she didn't understand, because she did. "What do you mean, 'No, I don't'?" she asked. Keller's voice grew firmer. "I mean, we've had issues at this property. I need you to step off the porch and provide identification." Amina held her gaze steady. "I will provide identification," she said, measured, "but I'm not stepping off my property because you said so." "Ma'am, you're refusing a lawful order," Keller replied. Amina's eyebrows lifted slightly. "A lawful order requires a lawful basis," she said. "This is where the video shows the first real shift." Keller's shoulders squared, his stance widened. His hand went to his belt again, not drawing, not escalating to a weapon, but signaling something older than policy. Control. "I don't have time for this," he said. Amina didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse. She didn't threaten. She did something far more dangerous to an ego. She stayed calm. "Officer," she said, "I'm Judge Amina Hayes. I live here. This is my home." There was another beat, the kind that, in a different world, would have ended the encounter. A reasonable officer might have said, "Okay, let's verify." He might have asked for a driver's license. He might have asked to see a utility bill. He might have run the address through the system and confirmed the registered owner. Instead, Keller's face hardened. He looked at her like she'd just tried to win an argument. "I don't care who you say you are," he said. "Step off the property." And that was the moment the story stopped being about a misunderstanding. Because it wasn't about whether Amina lived there. It was about whether she could be believed. If you've ever watched a situation tip, from normal to dangerous, you know it doesn't always happen with shouting. Sometimes it happens in a single decision. A decision to not listen. A decision to treat resistance as defiance. A decision to treat a person as a problem. Amina looked down at the folder she was holding. Inside were notes for a bail hearing scheduled that afternoon. The irony was almost unbearable. Here she was, a judge who spent her days weighing evidence, assessing credibility, and deciding whether the state had lawful authority over someone's freedom. And now she was being told, on her own porch, that authority wasn't enough. She spoke again, voice still controlled. "Officer Keller, she said. He flinched slightly. The bodycam caught it. How do you know my name? He asked. Because I see officers in my courtroom, Amina said, and because I take note of who stands before me. Keller's eyes narrowed. It wasn't fear, it was resentment, as if she'd crossed a line by recognizing him. Okay, he said, voice clipped. Now you're definitely coming with me if you don't comply. Amina exhaled through her nose, and this is where she made a move that, in hindsight, likely kept her safe. She didn't go down the steps. She didn't rush toward him. She reached slowly into her sweater pocket and pulled out her phone. I'm calling my attorney, she said. Keller stepped forward. Put the phone down. No, Amina replied. He took another step. Put the phone down right now. Amina's voice stayed steady, but the tension in the air sharpened. Officer, she said, I am not a suspect. I am a homeowner. I will provide identification. You are not going to escalate this. Keller's radio crackled with dispatch noise. He pressed the button. I need a supervisor, he repeated. Subject is refusing lawful commands. Possible trespass. Amina's head tilted slightly. Possible trespass, she echoed quietly, like she was tasting the absurdity. Then she added, for the camera and for the record. Officer, you're creating probable cause in real time, she said. From across the street, a curtain moved. A door cracked open. A neighbor stepped out with a phone held low at their side, pretending to check the weather while recording. This was no longer private. The block had become an audience, and audiences change behavior. Sometimes they make people behave better, sometimes they make people double down. Keller doubled down. Ma'am, he said, louder now, step off the property. You do not live here. You are trespassing. Amina's lips pressed together. She reached into the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. A deed abstract. Not the full closing packet, but enough. Her name printed clearly. The address. She held it up. Here, she said. My name. My address. Keller didn't take it. He didn't even lean in to read it. He waved his hand dismissively. That doesn't prove anything, he said. Amina stared at him for a long moment. If you've ever tried to argue reality with someone committed to a different story, you recognize that look. Not anger, not fear. A calculation. What is the safest next step when logic doesn't matter? Amina made her decision. Supervisor, she said. Now. Keller's mouth tightened. He's on his way. And until he arrives, Amina replied, I'm staying right here. Keller stepped closer to the bottom of the porch steps. You're obstructing, he said. Amina's voice stayed calm. Obstructing what, officer? Your assumption. There was a ripple, soft laughter maybe, coming from somewhere behind the camera. It was quick, it was quiet, but Keller heard it. His head snapped toward the sound, and then his focus came back to Amina with a sharper edge. Turn around, he said. Amina didn't move. Turn around and put your hands behind your back, Keller repeated. You can almost feel the air change in the video. The neighbor filming across the street goes silent. Someone whispers, No way! And Amina, still on her porch, looks directly at the camera on Keller's chest. Are you arresting me? She asks. Keller's voice is cold. For obstruction and trespassing. Yes. Amina nods slowly, almost as if she's memorizing every syllable. Then she speaks with the kind of clarity that sounds like history being written. Officer, she says, you are about to arrest a sitting judge on her own property based on a neighbor's suspicion. Keller doesn't answer. He steps forward again, and that's when another patrol car turns the corner. Sergeant Daniel Price arrives at 8:29 a.m. Older, more tired. The kind of supervisor who's seen enough to know what disasters look like from a distance. He parks and steps out. He watches for about 3 seconds before his eyes sharpen. Because the scene is wrong. Not because it's dramatic, because it's unnecessary. Price walks up the sidewalk, hands open, voice controlled. "Keller," he calls out. "What's going on?" Keller doesn't turn immediately. His body is squared to Amina, like he's afraid that if he breaks eye contact, he'll lose something. Finally, he glances back. "Possible trespass," Keller says. "Neighbor called. She won't step off the porch or provide ID properly." Price looks up at Amina. "Ma'am," he says, "can you tell me your name?" Amina doesn't hesitate. "Judge Amina Hayes," she replies. The sergeant's face shifts, not disbelief, recognition. There's a fraction of a second where the video shows something rare, a professional recalibration. Price nods. "Yes, ma'am," he says. Keller stiffens. Amina continues, voice steady. "This is my home. I have identification. I have paperwork. Officer Keller is refusing to verify and is threatening arrest." Price turns slightly toward Keller. "Keller," he says quietly. Just his name, but it lands like a warning. Keller speaks fast, as if he needs to justify the path he's already chosen. "People have been breaking into this place. I got a call. She's being difficult, Sarge. She's trying to play games." Price's eyes narrow. "Okay," Price says, calm. "Let's verify. That's what we do." He looks at Amina. "Judge," he says, "do you have your ID?" Amina holds it up. Price doesn't ask her to step off the porch. He doesn't demand. He asks. Amina steps down one stair, not to comply with Keller, but to hand the card to the sergeant. That distinction matters. Price takes the license, looks at it, looks at her, then says, "Thank you." Keller's jaw clenches. Price turns back to his patrol car, radios dispatch, and within seconds, the confirmation comes. Resident, owner, no warrants, no break-in, no crime, just a homeowner, and an officer who didn't believe her. Price walks back. He hands the ID to Amina with both hands, respectful. "Judge Hayes," he says, "I apologize for the inconvenience." Amina's eyes don't leave Keller. "Sergeant," she says, "this was not an inconvenience. This was an attempted unlawful arrest." Price swallows, because he knows she's right, and because he knows the body cam recorded it. "Keller," Price says, voice low now, "step back." Keller doesn't move immediately. Then, slowly, he takes a step away from the bottom stair. The physical retreat looks small, but in a confrontation like this, it's an admission. Amina exhales, and for the first time, her calm cracks just enough to show the human cost. "I am a judge," she says, not loud but firm, "and you were prepared to handcuff me on my porch because a neighbor didn't recognize me." Keller opens his mouth. Price cuts him off. "That's enough," Price says. Then he turns to Amina again. "Judge Hayes," he says, "would you like to file a complaint? We can have a lieutenant come out." Amina's gaze remains steady. "I want your lieutenant," she says, "and I want your chief to know before noon." The most dangerous part of a moment like this isn't always the confrontation, it's the aftermath, because what happens next decides whether the system protects itself or tells the truth. Amina went inside, not because she was retreating, because she was gathering evidence. She returned to the porch with the closing packet. Mortgage documents, the title report, utility bills, all the things that proved what she never should have had to prove. The lieutenant arrived at 9:04. Lieutenant Sarah Mendel, experienced, careful, the kind of administrator who spoke in policy language even when she was angry. She approached the porch with an apology ready. But Amina didn't want a performance. She wanted accountability. And she wanted to know a simple thing. What would have happened if Sergeant Price had been 5 minutes later? Because Keller was already at the edge, already speaking the language of arrest, already building a narrative. That question, what would have happened, would become the heartbeat of the lawsuit. Not because it was speculative, because the body cam showed intent, and intent is not a misunderstanding. Here's where the story takes a turn most viewers don't expect, because this wasn't the first time Judge Hayes had heard Officer Keller's name. Not on a street, in a courtroom. Months earlier, Amina had presided over a suppression hearing involving a different officer, an arrest where a person claimed they were searched without lawful cause. The defense had argued the stop was based on vague suspicion. The prosecution had argued officer safety. Amina had ruled with a precise, careful opinion. She didn't accuse anyone of racism. She didn't grandstand. She simply wrote what the law required. That evidence obtained without proper justification must be excluded. The department had felt it, not because she attacked them, because she didn't bend. When a judge insists on the rules, it forces everyone else to face the truth. And there was something else. In that suppression hearing, Keller's name had come up, not as the arresting officer, but as a witness who arrived later. In court, he'd been impatient, dismissive, the kind of attitude that looks like confidence until it meets a judge who doesn't mistake arrogance for credibility. Amina remembered him, because when he took the stand, he didn't look at her. He looked through her, like she was a formality. Now, on her porch, he looked at her the same way, and the lawsuit would eventually argue that it wasn't just a neighbor's call that drove the encounter. It was something deeper, a pattern, a comfort with disbelief, a belief that authority is a weapon, not a responsibility. If you're watching this and wondering, could this really happen to someone with that kind of status? That's the point. Status doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it just makes the insult clearer, because when the person in front of you is a judge and you still treat them like they don't belong, the message is unmistakable. It was never about paperwork. It was about permission. Permission to exist in a space someone else assumed they owned. By noon, the incident had already climbed the chain of command. The chief was briefed. Internal Affairs opened a preliminary review, and Amina did something most people can't do when they're shaken. She went to work. She put on her robe. She sat on the bench. She heard cases. She kept her voice steady. But anyone who knew her well could see it. Her patience was thinner. Not because she was angry at the people in front of her, because she had just seen how fragile the line was between respect and force. That night, after court, she met with her attorney. Not because she wanted a payday, because she wanted the truth documented, because she understood something most people learn too late. If you don't write the record, someone else will, and their record will protect them. The first filing came 3 weeks later. A civil complaint alleging constitutional violations, unlawful detention, threatened arrest without probable cause, discriminatory policing, failure to supervise. The headline number, $5.1 million, wasn't presented as a lottery ticket. It was a statement of damages, reputational harm, emotional distress, the cost of being treated like a suspect at your own front door. And the complaint included something that gave it weight beyond any dollar amount. It included the Bodycam transcript. It included the moment Keller said, "No, you don't." And it included the moment he announced an arrest. The city's attorneys watched the footage and realized they weren't dealing with an argument. They were dealing with evidence. When the footage leaked, because it always leaks, the public reaction was immediate. Not just outrage. Recognition. People saw in Amina what they'd felt in their own lives. The polite disbelief. The demand to prove your right to stand where you stand. The way a situation becomes dangerous the moment an officer decides your dignity is defiance. And there was a moment in the footage that became a kind of national shorthand. It wasn't the arrest threat. It wasn't the yelling. It was the piece of paper. Amina holding up proof, and Keller refusing to look, because that moment wasn't about law, it was about will, the will to believe or the will to deny. The department tried to contain it. They issued a statement about a misunderstanding. They promised additional training. They said they were reviewing the incident. But the lawsuit wasn't satisfied with broad language, because broad language is how institutions avoid specificity, and specificity was where the truth lived. During discovery, attorneys requested Keller's prior stops, bodycam audits, complaint history, supervisor notes, and while the public didn't see every detail, one thing became clear through what was argued in court. This wasn't isolated. There had been other moments, other complaints, other times where Keller's tone escalated quickly, other times where someone said he didn't listen. Not always enough to force a termination, but enough to show a pattern. And patterns are dangerous in policing, because patterns don't need a crisis to cause harm. They just need repetition. The major twist came when a private investigator, hired by the plaintiff's team, uncovered the neighbor behind the original call, not by rumor, by records, a caller ID tied to the EAKC, non-emergency line, a statement logged by dispatch, and then, later, an interview. The neighbor wasn't concerned about a break-in, not really. They were upset about the renovation, the contractors, the trucks, the noise. They'd complained before. They'd written emails to a neighborhood association. They'd used words like property values and character of the street. But what they'd never said out loud until that call was the assumption at the center of it all. They didn't believe the new homeowner belonged. In the investigator's notes, the neighbor reportedly admitted they thought the woman might be a squatter or a caretaker, someone who could be moved along, not someone who could sue, not someone who could subpoena, not someone who could turn a porch confrontation into a systemic case. That revelation changed how the public interpreted everything, because it wasn't just a cop's decision, it was a community's instinct, a reflex, a weaponized phone call, and an officer willing to treat the call as truth. At this point, the case stopped being only about Keller. It became about the pipeline, how suspicion becomes a dispatch code, how a dispatch code becomes an assumption, how an assumption becomes a command, how a command becomes a threat, how a threat becomes handcuffs, unless someone interrupts the chain. Sergeant Price was the interruption, but the lawsuit argued something sharper. A system that requires a good supervisor to prevent a bad arrest is not a system you can trust. There was a hearing 6 months later that drew a crowd, not because it was dramatic, because it was symbolic. Judge Hayes didn't preside over it, of course. She sat in the gallery, and in the front row were activists, attorneys, neighborhood residents, and a handful of off-duty officers who understood what was at stake. The city's legal team argued qualified immunity. They argued the officer was responding to a call. They argued the situation was unclear, but the plaintiff's attorney didn't let the argument float in abstract air. He anchored it to the video. "Where," he asked, "does the officer attempt to verify residency before escalating to arrest?" Silence. "Where," he asked again, "does he read the document she offers?" Silence. "And when she identifies herself as a judge," the attorney continued, "what changes in his behavior?" The answer was uncomfortable. Nothing. If you had to pick the single image that defined this case for many people, it wasn't a courtroom, it was that porch, that ordinary porch, because porches are supposed to mean safety. They're the threshold between the world and your home, a place where you greet friends, where you watch storms roll in, where you sit with coffee and feel like your life is yours. And in that footage, the porch becomes a stage where belonging is put on trial, not by a jury, by a uniform. As litigation dragged on, the city faced a decision every municipality fears: fight and risk a verdict, or settle and admit, indirectly, that something went wrong. Settlements aren't always confessions. Sometimes they're risk management, but they still speak, because money has a language institutions understand. And in this case, the number that circulated was the number from the initial complaint, $5.1 million. Was it a demand, a potential settlement, a projected exposure? In public talk, those distinctions blur, but what matters is what the case represented. A figure large enough to make a city council nervous, large enough to force policy changes, large enough to make other departments watch, because they knew if this could happen to a judge, it could happen to anyone. Behind closed doors, the department initiated reforms. They didn't call them reforms, they called them protocol updates. But the substance mattered. Supervisory, response requirements for homeowner disputes and verification steps before a trespass arrest, Bodycam review audits focused on tone escalation, training on bias and on the legal limits of commands. And, quietly, Officer Keller was pulled off patrol, placed on administrative duty. The official line was, pending investigation. But inside the department, officers understood what it meant. The city was protecting itself, because the camera had made protection necessary. Judge Hayes spoke publicly only once during the case, at a community forum held in a high school auditorium, the kind of forum where folding chairs creak and microphones squeal if you hold them wrong. She stepped up to the podium and didn't perform anger. She performed clarity. "I do not want anyone arrested for what happened to me," she said. A murmur spread through the room. Some people wanted punishment. She wanted change. "I want a department," she continued, "that understands that a ER phone call is not evidence, that a uniform does not grant unlimited authority, and that a person standing on their own property does not have to earn the right to be believed." She paused, then she added the sentence that made the room go quiet. "If the sergeant hadn't arrived," she said, "you would have watched a judge go to jail for owning a home." That line wasn't rhetorical, it was a warning. Here's the part that often gets lost in viral clips. Amina didn't win this case because she was powerful. She survived it because she was careful. She stayed on the porch. She spoke to the camera. She called for a supervisor. She documented. Those are strategies people learn when they understand something painful. The system doesn't always treat truth as truth. It treats it as a negotiation. Amina refused to negotiate her reality. As the case neared resolution, negotiations intensified. There were draft agreements, non-disparagement clauses, policy, commitments, confidential terms, and, like so many civil cases, the final details weren't all public, but the consequences were. The City Council held a public session acknowledging a failure of process. The department announced new verification policies, and Officer Keller, whether through termination, resignation, or reassignment, did not return to street patrol in the same way. For the department, it was damage control. For the community, it was a lesson. For Amina, it was something else entirely. It was a scar, not because she lost, because she learned again that respect in America can be conditional, and that conditional respect is not respect at all. If you had been on that block that morning, you might have thought it was a small scene, a cop, a homeowner, a misunderstanding. But the truth is, small scenes reveal big systems. A phone call reveals a bias. A dispatch code reveals an assumption. An officer reveals a willingness to escalate. A supervisor reveals what should have happened from the start. And a body camera reveals the part no one can spin. Near the end of the litigation, one reporter asked a question that sounded simple. "Judge Hayes," the reporter said, "what was the worst part?" Amina didn't say the officer's tone. She didn't say the threat of arrest. She didn't say the humiliation. she said something quieter. The worst part, she answered, was realizing he wasn't confused. She let that sit. He was certain, she continued, certain that I didn't belong, certain that he didn't need to check, certain that his certainty was enough. That's what made the case dangerous. Not one officer's mistake, one officer's certainty. And that brings us back to the cold open, the command. Step off the property. If you strip away the uniform, it's just a sentence, but in the hands of authority, it becomes a test of whether you comply with something unlawful to avoid something worse, a test of whether you surrender your dignity for safety, a test of whether the law is real or just a story told to the people with the least power. Judge Hayes passed that test without raising her voice. She passed it by insisting on verification, by speaking to the camera, by forcing the system to face its own evidence. Now, here's a question worth sitting with, just for a moment. If this could happen on a quiet street to a person who literally interprets the law for a living, what does that say about the people who have no title, no platform, and no camera pointed at their chest? That's not a rhetorical question meant to make you angry. It's a real one, because the answer shapes what we demand next. The porch is still there, the paint is still fresh, the windows still catch the morning light. Some days, Amina sits out there with coffee and case files, exactly as she intended when she bought the house. But the porch has a different meaning now. It's not just where she lives, it's where the system showed its hand, and where a judge, who'd spent her career weighing other people's credibility, was forced to defend her own, not in court, at home, on a Tuesday morning that looked too ordinary to become a headline, until a neighbor made a call, until an officer decided certainty mattered more than verification, until a supervisor arrived just in time, and until a camera recorded what the law would later have to answer for. Because in the end, that's what the $5.1 million case really was. Not a number, a record, a warning, and, for anyone paying attention, a reminder that the smallest abuses of power, unchecked, are how the biggest injustices begin.